presentation. And you are right. So I have a computer science background. I do not have an AI background, but now everybody's doing AI, right? So my opinion is as good as anybody else. So because I don't have an AI background, my talk is very HPC oriented, but it's how HPC is looking at AI and why are we afraid of it, and what to expect from HPC applications moving forward as more of them incorporate AI and large language models and everything into their applications, into their workflows. I know the title is benchmarking, and I am going to talk about benchmarking a little bit. I'm going to look at what benchmarking looks like in HPC, how AI patterns change what we've seen by benchmarking HPC applications, and then how benchmarking AI applications looks like. But since my background is workflow and HPC, my main concern is how do workflows that combine AI and HPC look like? What are their computational and I/O patterns? And can we benchmark them? Can we simulate the same kind of stress that they would put on the system by just benchmarking? I'm going to have three distinct parts. The first one is very HPC oriented, and maybe you're not that interested in it, or maybe you know it very well, but I think it's relevant to know what were the issues that HPC applications encountered as they evolved, and why HPC is so tuned for their specific characteristics. Then my second part is going to be our experience with AI patterns in HPC. And so far, it's been applications just including some AI kernels into their codes, or some training applications that are run by themselves on data that was generated by simulations, or on image data sets. I'm going to have some results for MRIs for cancer research. And then how these patterns slowly evolve towards complex workflows that combine all these different AI kernels with HPC in real time, running in a coupled fashion. And I will end with how benchmarking worked for us when we focus on these types of workflows. If you have any questions, leave them in the chat, and somebody should interrupt me and I can take them, or we can talk at the end. This talk should take 36 minutes, so we should have time for questions at the end. So traditional HPC, these are large monolithic codes. They're usually high fidelity simulations that simulate some physical phenomena. They're iterative in nature. They're fairly predictable. We have benchmarks and roofline models that kind of predict their performance. I'm very interested in the I/O, and we've seen that I/O is becoming a bottleneck at scale, not only for HPC, but also for AI, and then for workflows that combine the two. So my talk will kind of focus on I/O a little bit more than the computation or more than other overheads that might be encountered. So traditional HPC is write-oriented. You have these large codes, these simulations that generate data, and data needs to be stored somewhere. They have to take checkpoints because they're so large that fault tolerance is becoming a problem. For this, the systems have evolved by adding burst buffers so that they deal with this burst of a lot of writing that's happened with some frequency. From the workflow perspective, we have ensemble simulations that are trying to look at different parameter spaces, but they're all running by themselves and generating data that is stored and later analyzed. We sometimes have in situ analysis and visualization, but again, they're fairly predictable, so we know what the impact on the performance of the simulation is. And they're usually designed so that they don't really impact the simulation. And the figure on the left is something that if you attended any HPC talk, you know what this figure is. It's the top 500 supercomputers and how their performance kept increasing as we reached petascale and exascale. Benchmarking, so there are many papers on how to benchmark different types of HPC applications. In general, right now, every national lab is using some type of mini apps to benchmark or stress different parts of the system. And these are miniature versions of HPC scientific codes. For LLN, it's the Mantevo mini apps, and there's many papers that deal with this. Mini sweep, for example, is one of these examples. So that's the figure on the right. This mini app performs a sweep computation across a grid. This represents a 3D volume in space, and usually want to calculate the position, energies, and flows of some particles, neutrons, for example, in nuclear reactors. The yellow cube marks the beginning location of the sweep, and then the green cubes are dependent upon the yellow cubes, the blue cubes are dependent upon the green cubes, and so forth. And the picture below shows the scalability of the sweep mini apps versus the de novo code. De novo is a discrete ordinators transport code that uses state-of-the-art solution methods to obtain accurate solution for the Boltzmann transport equation. So that's what the typical HPC application would do. And then the red line is the mini app. And the figure shows the comparative performance of the two. And even though they're not exactly the same, they do show kind of the same weak scaling behavior. So it's good enough to understand what the application would do. And this is basically how all mini apps behave. We also have roof models, and there are many for many purposes, but in their original form, and that's what the figure on the left is, they were used to bound floating point performance, so flops per second, as a function of machine peak performance, machine peak bandwidth, and arithmetic intensity of the application. And then the curve, which is the hollow purple line in the figure, can be viewed as the performance envelope under which kernel application performance exists. The reach point, this one, is called the machine balance point. And if an application arithmetic intensity is lower than this point, it's considered to be bandwidth bound. So it's bound by how fast the data can be moved through the memory system instead of how fast the calculation can be done on the CPU. So based on where your application fits here, you would know what you need to optimize. If you're bound by the how fast the computations can be done, you might want to improve vectorization, or you want to use multi-threaded or things like that. So things like this exist for all the applications, and we have been able to predict performance. And this is in perfect conditions, because in HPC, because the system is so large and so complex, there are many other problems that can occur. And I wrote 4 here just because throughout my life, I've studied all of them, and the overheads that they put on the application can become serious depending on the nature of your application and how serious the problem is. And we're just going to look very fast at a few of them, just to get an idea of what the overhead could be. So research contention is when multiple application or multiple processes of the same applications are trying to access the same resource. And we've seen the lower figure shows the I/O throughput decrease on Intrepid was a precursor to Mira at Argonne. So 3 generations ago of HPC system, and you could have throughput decreases of even 60% in some cases. And what's more important is when you look on the right figure, it's not very clear to know why this variability occurs, and it's really hard to model it. But it's there, and it causes a lot of problems. And I/O libraries are aware of this, and we have algorithms that are trying to hide this variability and this overhead from the application. Faults are an issue. So when you're running at the scale of Summit or Frontier, you might have some fault every hour. I remember when I was working for my PhD for Blue Waters had something every 8 hours. So if your application is running on the entire machine and is running for more than 8 hours, you're guaranteed to have at least one kind of failure. And this was my PhD study, so I'm not going to go into detail, but a lot of the failures crash the application, for which there's checkpoint restart solutions where the application takes a snapshot of the state of its data. And then if the failure occurred, then it can restart from that snapshot. But as the size increases, and as the frequency of the failure increases, you might need to take more checkpoints. And sometimes it takes a few hours to save the state of the application. So if in the future, the prediction on the bottom, well, this turned out not to be true, but a lot of the people working in fault tolerance were predicting that the mean time between failures is going to be minutes, and then the time to save the application is going to be in minutes as well, in which case no progress could be done. So that's not the case, but 20% overhead in taking checkpoints can occur. And this is not modeled by any benchmark or performance model. A lot of other failures, so if we look at this table, only 5% of Lustre metadata failures end up in a crash. The other ones are just degrading the performance of the application, and it can go to 2.7x slower for a limited amount of time until the failure is fixed or until you're not reading anymore or not using the metadata server anymore. But this can add up, and then you don't understand the performance if you just look at the benchmark. Silent failures are another concern. So these are failures that don't crash the application. They're not even detected. They can go undetected for a while, and then they either turn up at some point in the future by crashing or by giving an error in the data that you're having. And we have information redundancy that provides fault tolerance through replication of the coding of the data. There's time redundancy where you achieve fault tolerance by performing an operation several times, for example. The most popular, I think, is the algorithm-based fault tolerance, where this is a methodology of data error detection and correction that's using information redundancy containing separate data structure from the primary data. So, for example, in matrix multiplication, application-based fault tolerance consists of storing checksum data in vectors separate from the matrix, and we use that for error detection and correction. Again, the overheads here, so these are, the figure shows different applications and the overheads of implementing such algorithmic-based detections. And it's, again, 20%. Scheduling, so nobody's really measuring the scheduling time. So how long it takes since you submit your job until you actually run your job, right? When we benchmark the applications, we only care about when they start running because that's when we start paying. But in cancer research, not necessarily in cancer research, but in neuroscience, for example, in some cases, they wanted the results right away. So the wait time was really important for them. They wanted to be able to execute right away. And there are different scheduling strategies that give different benefits between, so on the horizontal axis is the size of the job. The larger the jobs, the more you wait because you need all these nodes to be free in order to execute it. But so because there's a trade-off between how long the big jobs are going to wait, how long the small jobs are going to wait, you don't want to impact either of them. The solution that is accepted right now as the default solution on most of the system is the first come, first serve, but with priority and backfilling. Priority means the more you stay in the queue, the more priority you have. Backfilling means that the small jobs are going to have if there are gaps in when big jobs are scheduled, then small jobs can just use these. And there are small optimizations depending on each system. I think on all SCF, we give priority to larger jobs, and we rely on backfilling more to execute the small jobs. And the figure on the right is kind of the distribution of the wait time based on the job size that we get on a typical HPC system, which works fine for HPC systems, for HPC applications. But then once you move more towards AI, and this is when I was at Vanderbilt, neuroscience was using a lot of AI methods to classify MRIs. And we looked at the profile of their job a little bit. And this figure shows with blue the wall time in seconds for each type of application that they were using. And then the IO traffic with pink for, again, each type of application that they were using. And there's a huge variability between them based on some properties within the MRI. So depending on how the MRI was produced and the resolution and quality of the image, you could have an execution time between 4.5 hours and 18 hours. And when you submit these jobs on an HPC system, you have to ask for some amount of time for your job to run. If you ask for 20 hours, then it's going to be harder for you to get an allocation because you're asking for a huge job. If you only use 4 hours after the 20 hours that you asked, you might get penalized because you are putting more stress on the system. Depends on the system. OLCF doesn't penalize it anymore, but for the cluster that Vanderbilt was using, they were getting penalties, and then their priority decreases, and they were ending up waiting in the queue for hours to be able to execute. So the solution that we came up with was pretty simple. We just asked for some amount based on what we think is going to be the most likely time that's going to execute the entire job. And we take a checkpoint at the end, and then we re-ask for a new allocation and we restart from the checkpoint. So this worked out fine, but then once we will start doing large workflows, this might not necessarily work anymore. So we have a bunch of frameworks. I'm not going to go through them. You're going to have the slides that deal on solving all these problems and offering good solution for HPC applications so they don't have to deal with all this. So then the question to should benchmarking include any of these external factors? The answer was not really. You don't need to benchmark them because each individual framework is benchmarking this anyway, and you're going to understand the performance of your application as long as you understand what kind of frameworks it's using underneath. And so far, everything has been great. So we've worked with all these applications, and they were able to scale on Frontier and get really good performance. So on the right side, I'm showing the IO time that we obtain for two. One is a particle in cell code, the other one is a fusion simulation. And we get up to 8 terabytes per second, and then they have continuous to speed up between Summit and Frontier. And as Frontier gets new features, they kept being able to speed it up. So everything is great. We have all these applications that are floating in an HPC environment happily with all the frameworks underneath that take care of hiding all the complexities of the HPC system for them. And then in the next years, in the last few years, we got all these new monsters that are using the HPC system that we don't really understand. They kind of look the same as the HPC applications, but not really. And now they're wanting to run together with the HPC applications, maybe at the same time. And they're stressing the Summit in completely new ways than what we expected. And when we benchmarked individual AI applications, we observed that this is not going to scale at the size of Summit if we don't do something about it. So let's try to understand a little bit the AI patterns in HPC. So as we evolved, we kind of saw a switch in the I/O, that the aggregated I/O at the level of the system. So if we look at the evolution of read versus how many applications are read intensive, how many applications are write intensive on Jaguar, Titan, and Summit, and these are 3 generations of HPC system and Oak Ridge. The amount of write increased a little bit with Titan, and we think that's because the size of the machine was larger, there were more checkpoints, but then it kept decreasing. So there are more and more reads as we move to Summit and as we look at Summit throughout the years. And this turned out is mostly because of the convergence with AI and the fact that a lot of applications are using AI. And when we look at the average of the adoption of AI and ML on Summit, we found that it's 40% in average between 2019 and 2022. And when we were looking in 2019, it was 70% of the application did not have any AI in their code. So that's a huge increase. And this paper that I'm citing at the bottom does a really good job at explaining what types of AI kernels have been seen on Summit between these years. And I copy-pasted the table here. And it's basically for fault detection. So just to detect algorithmic or other failure in execution, this is to replace algorithmic-based fault tolerance. We have kernels that are enhancing some mathematical computation. We have a submodel that replaces a science kernel by an ML model. And this I've seen in the molecular dynamic code that we're working on, and I'm kind of simulating some of this later in the slides. Steering is to steer the direction of a computation or some internal process. And the way that I've seen this on Summit so far is to guide Monte Carlo simulations and are incorporated inside the application. So these are not 2 separate codes that are running together. It's just one big code that has a ML model that is trying to steer Monte Carlo to undersampled regions. Surrogate models is trying to replace a full science application, a full science model. And if you look at the example, this is for fusion, where we want to replace a tokamak simulation by a surrogate model. And I actually worked with this application, so I know exactly what they're doing. And right now, the way they're running it is by running the application together with the surrogate model and trying to train it. And then the surrogate model is steering the simulation towards undersampled regions in real time so that it gets better accuracy. But it still ran as one big workflow, but it's going closer to separate near real-time runs. Analysis, so we have graph neural networks that are analyzing the results of molecular dynamic simulation. In cancer research, you have classification codes that are trying to parse whole slide images or MRIs. Or then the next one is more of a coupled type of workflow where you have the ML running together with the traditional simulation in a coupled format. And this is the same for training, the example with training surrogate models. So these are the same, but you could have the digital twin running together with the simulation. Okay, classification, this is exactly what you would expect. And the other one, we're not really sure what they are. What's interesting here is that when you look at the percentage of applications that are using each of these types of AI models, only 2 to 4% of them are doing coupled runs. The rest are basically either pure ML, like training something or analyzing something using an ML model, or a mix of HPC and ML within the same HPC application. In my experience, so this was the case until 2023, until last year. Last year, DOE opened a bunch of calls for digital twins and for large complex workflows. So in the future, on the projects that I'm on, in Fusion, there's one in SNS, so Scatter Neuron Sciences. Hypersonic is the same. There are some in radio astronomy that are going to do the same. So they're all moving towards trying to couple big experiments with first principle-based simulations that are running on HPC systems, with digital twins or surrogate models that are either running on the same systems or on other systems. And then all this need to be coupled with analysis and visualization. And this is how applications are going to look like in the future. And if we look at it from the perspective of the facilities, it could be completely distributed. So we could have the instrument or the sensor that's someplace having some on-the-edge devices that are going to be used for some reduction or some small analysis, or maybe running a surrogate model that is steering the instrument that connects to the large simulation that's running on LCFR leadership computing facilities. So big machines, big supercomputers that are running the first principle-based simulation, maybe having some analysis that's going to check if the surrogate model gives accurate information. If not, maybe it's going to trigger some new training on the surrogate model, and all is going to be connected to analysis and workflow that might be done at the on the laptop, on the scientist's laptop, or some other site where the scientist can interact with. And this is going to be typical in the future. So where are LLMs in all of this? LLMs, for me, I haven't played with LLMs until 6 months ago. And that's because one of the material science project was parsing papers in order to create LLMs capable of predicting properties of chemical formulas. So they're using this CIF chip or CIF files that is storing the chemical formula. From this, they can create graph neural networks, and by parsing all the papers that are connected to this formula network, they create some LLMs. And together, all this huge system that contains GNN and NLM, they use this to guide the training of a digital twin. So they're running the first, the simulation, the material science simulation that is trying to come up with a new material that will give a given property. They run this with a digital twin that is trying to steer the simulation towards chemical formulas that have a chance of giving the property they want. And this digital twin takes information from the GNN and LLM. So it's a huge, complex workflow that will run concurrent on the HPC system. So I had to start being interested in LLMs because they start being part of all the applications that want to use our IO libraries and our workflow system underneath. So we tried benchmarking, and before we look at how benchmarking looks like, there is this paper that evaluates the training. So for my applications, I don't necessarily need the training, but it was really good to understand the performance that I would expect from the digital twin training. So the accuracy of the deep learning models scale with the amount of the data. And this was something that we kind of knew before, but it wasn't fully demonstrated until the emergence of transformer-based LLMs. And this paper on the bottom that I think is a really interesting read, it's from one of our colleagues at Oak Ridge. No, Fei, everybody probably knows him. They're looking at how the loss of LLMs scales with both the training data and model parameters. So it scales with the amount of computation. In the formula below, P and D are the number of parameters and tokens respectively. And this formula, the fact that they are scaling, can be intuitively derived from the transformer architecture, so from the figure from the slides. So compared to the attention and other blocks, the feed-forward block typically requires the most computation. So for each element of a feed-forward weight matrix, there are a total of 6 flops. You have one multiply-add operation during the forward pass and 2 multiply-add operations during the backward pass. And this is per input token. So coupled with the optimal training guidance that the paper is showing, the computation scales quadratically with the model size. And they updated this model for parallel training, taking into account distributed training, and then I think it was PyTorch fully shared data parallel. And they build a cost model to make runtime and energy projections. And this figure is trying to show the total number of compute operations needed for the optimal training. So we have on the horizontal axis the model parameters, and then the time and the flops that are required to train LLM for this number of parameters. In this, there are 2 examples. So training 165 billion parameters, that's GPT-3, requires 3.7 exaflops, and it quickly grows to 1.2 exaflops for 1 terabyte. It's actually, yeah, it's 120 for 1 terabyte for GPT. And this can serve as a quick heuristic to maximize the return of LLM modeling under a compute budget constraint. So for a given model size with P parameters, the region below the solid line, that's the blue region, indicates that the data size is insufficient. So the number of tokens is less than what you expect. So in this case, I think it's 20p. And then for a compute budget, the region above the solid line, the yellow one, means that the output accuracy would likely benefit from increasing the model size. So this kind of can give the ideal training times, given the peak performance on Summit and Frontier. So Summit is using V100s, and it has 112 teraflops, and that's how this line is being drawn. And then Frontier has 384 teraflops. And then from this, you can kind of have a feeling of how long it would take to train each model on Frontier or on Summit. So for example, for GPT-3, you would have 3 days on Frontier as long as you use the entire Frontier, and it's the ideal training time, so you don't have any other problems, and then 14 days for GPT-3. So we use something similar in order to benchmark the deep learning, not with LLMs, because for LLMs, we don't do this as part of the workflow. We train the LLMs separately, and then we use the trained LLM to help training the digital twin. So from my applications perspective, it's much more interesting to model the inference of LLMs together with training the digital twin. So we try to develop some workflow mini apps that take into account a simulation running together with an AI model, training an AI model. And we did this by looking at the patterns of summit applications in the last 4 years and tried to profile the behavior of each type of application in order to be able to create some mini benchmarks for each and then combine them into a workflow. And I don't have a lot of time to go over this. If anyone is interested, has not been published yet, so I don't have a link to give you, but I can talk about this later. We basically create clusters of behavior and then characterize each cluster. And then from the aggregated characterization of the cluster, we go to time series information and create some mini app that is simulating the time series behavior of this cluster of applications. And then we scale up and down the behavior of each component depending on how large you want to run it on. And scaling it up and down is not trivial. And we use some very simple heuristics for now because I control the applications that we were running. So I kind of know how their behavior scales up and down. And I assume the same behavior for the mini apps. But if we want a benchmark that is more general, this is not going to be easy to do. So for the training component, I use the model from the previous paper to scale it up and down. And this is just to show you how the time series information was extracted for each of these applications. And on the left side, we have a typical HPC application that opens the file in the beginning, reads some parameters initially, and then with a certain frequency keeps writing. And in this case, it writes two things because one is a checkpoint and the other one is writing the data. On the right side, it's an AI application. And I can't remember, I think this is it might be an inference, not a training application, but it's very similar. So there are many, many, many clusters of open, seek, read, close that happen in a very short amount of time. So it's a bit different than on the left. And then when you run them together, they interfere with each other and the performance is horrible, but we'll look at this in a second. So what we wanted was to benchmark running a simulation together with the training. And we ran molecular dynamic simulation labs with training of an AI code. All right, this might have been Gray Scott. Anyway, it's an HPC simulation that's running together with a training. If we run them separate, then we get the performance that's yellow. And this is by running first the molecular dynamic simulation. This one generates the data. And then after it's done, we run the training code that reads the data, trains the model, and ends. If we run them together, the simulation together with the training, then they interfere with each other. The file system doesn't like it. They're both degraded, so the performance is 1.5x in average slower for each of them, for the simulation and for the training. And the variability is huge between each loop. When we use the mini apps to predict this, we get the yellow performance. And that's because we don't simulate the interaction between them. Right, we train the mini apps to be able to simulate the AI training. We have one that simulates this type of HPC simulation. And when we run them together, they each access their own data. So they're not stressing the file system because all these files are going to be on different OSTs. So because there's such a complex IO stack on on Frontier on any HPC system, we don't want to try to model it, and we don't want to necessarily try to change the mini app right now, because we want to be able to create this automatically, not based on one particular synchronization between them. So for now, we just avoided the file system altogether, and we use streaming. In this case, I control both codes. They both use Adios, which is the IO library that we developed, and we can change some parameter in Adios to switch from going through the file system to going through the network. So underneath, we use either MPI or libfabric or something else that avoids the file system together. And in this case, the mini app had very similar performance to what we are seeing. Also, the variation is much less, and the performance is what we expect for training the digital twin. So this was great. Okay, so the results that we have, this is the mini app workflow mini apps compared to the actual workflow. And even though there's some variation in the performance, the trend is exactly the same. So this was great. But we got this only because we didn't go through the file system, and maybe because we're only running at small scale and we don't have to include any of the other things that we have to include in the HPC. And the biggest problem here is that all this, the AI and HPC are all using different frameworks that don't know about each other and have their own optimization. And when we create the mini apps, we get the same patterns that each of this application has, but then when we recreate it by using a specific software. For the IO case, we are using POSIX directly, but the simulation is using Adios, and the training, maybe it's using the PyTorch loader. These are not going to have the same pattern as POSIX, and when they interfere with each other, they're going to interfere differently because they each optimize their IO for their own application. So we don't have that. All right, we only have 10 minutes, so I'm not going to stay long on this example. So we wanted to see, even if we can avoid the file system, do we get the same performance with the benchmark regardless of what the AI application is? And we looked at training where it was easy to scale it up and down. It was easy to control the fact that it was Adios. And now we went to cancer research. And here what they want to do is inference. So they already have VGG16 or I think it's Intrepid V4 or something like that. They have two models that are already trained to classify images. And they want to go through, in this case, 60K whole slide images and find cancerous cells. Each instance runs on a separate file. We were able, so they don't interact with each other, which means that if we can characterize this type of application inside a mini app, then running all of them together as one workflow will give the correct prediction. So that was great. Going through the file system, if we run the mini app or if you run the application, is exactly the same thing. But it's not really fair because it's just one application. However, if we separate them into multiple applications, because as you know, we want to avoid the file system as much as we can, and we do pre-processing application that's separate, that goes through all these 60K whole slide images, pre-processes them, extracts the chunks, creates the batch sizes, and streams the data to two separate applications, one that is doing the classification on the VGG16 network and the other one doing on the Inception V4, we get a 10x speed up in the performance just because we don't have thousands of processes that are accessing the file system at the same time. By the way, these results are on Summit. I'm not sure if on Frontier is the same. I haven't run it. But on Summit, we had 10x speed up when we separate the application in two and we don't access the file system with all of them. But there's only one a process that accesses in a predictable fashion, so it's easy to prefetch the data. However, when we go and look at the mini apps was unable to predict this performance because, again, we didn't understand the interaction between the two, and now there's an interaction, so the workflow is incapable of doing this. And then the big test that we did, so we tried running the the material science workflow, and we have issues. That's why I don't have results on running that at scale, because it's so hard to get the data curated enough to get good accuracy. So we didn't have good accuracy yet. So I went to a smaller scale and found a bunch of codes that have pre-trained LLMs for molecular dynamics. I trained the GNN mark. I didn't care about the performance, so I didn't look at the accuracy of this. All I cared is to see if the workflow mini apps are able to predict the performance of running together an ensemble of lamps, which are molecular dynamic simulations, together with a pre-trained LLM and a pre-trained GNN, and use all this to train a digital twin. So the digital twin starts different lamps codes with different input parameters, or kills lamp simulations that don't give it data that is going to increase its accuracy. And it's doing this by communicating with LLM and GNN. And for the purpose of this demo, I'm ignoring what the LLM is saying because it's trained or something else. But I wanted to see the performance. And first, I want to show how the training profile looks like. And it's horrible. So this is in minutes. I don't know why we don't have the unit. In 1 minute, there are hundreds of open, read, close that are done by the spiking neural network. So I don't understand what it's doing there. I don't control this code, so I cannot avoid the file system. So that's happening. And then when we look at, so I profiled all these separate codes and tried to run them together as a mini app. And as we increase the number of nodes and as we increase the number of runs inside one ensemble, the performance that we predict is way off compared to what we see on the system. So definitely synchronization between components is essential. I have not found a benchmark that takes this into account. I have found benchmarks for AI. I have found benchmarks for HPC. When I run them together, I don't necessarily get the same performance as when I run the two codes together. And that's one, because they're modeling separate components, and two, because all these components are using different libraries, and we're not modeling the libraries. We're using whatever the benchmark wants to use, and it's usually the same thing for both codes. So when we have an HPC library, adios, on both the training and the simulation, it's much easier to control the optimization than when one is using PyTorch, the other one is using AI. And this is almost the last slide. Connecting back to the checkpointing and scheduling and all that, there are libraries that are offering checkpointing for AI as well, that deal with models, with distributed models and all that. They might have contradicting optimizations compared to the checkpointing for HPC. So I don't know, but all these factors that we ignored when we were benchmarking HPC application, maybe we'll have to start revisiting them. We'll have to revisit them in order to understand how we lose performance when we run workflows with both. So conclusion, we need new solutions. I'm not going to read this. Let's leave it at that. So we have 4 minutes of questions. I don't have the solution. I would like to know what you guys are using for benchmarking. Thank you. And you're going to have the slides. If you have questions in the future, my email is here. Just send an email and I'll try to answer.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna.